Hello and welcome to today's episode of Countercurrents. I am pleased to be joined by my friend, Professor Syed Mohammad Marandi. Enjoy. Well, I'm happy to have you back, Syed. You know, a fellow American. Most people don't know that. They got you as some sort of Iranian radical. Hey, born in Ohio. So
Well,
that.
actually, I was born in Richmond, Virginia.
Oh, really? Oh my God, a
Yeah.
Virginian. Hey, the first state in America, I guess. Uh, so we'll refer to you as a Southerner. Oh, so you spent last week in Beirut, and you
That's
were
right.
there for the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah. I was fortunate. I was invited to attend, unable to do so, but I did make a video contribution to the memory of Sheikh Nasrallah. Give me your overall impression of how it went.
Well, for me, it was, I mean, for everyone, it was an extraordinary event. In my case, it was special in the sense that I was in Beirut when he was martyred. I arrived in Beirut the day before, and I was at the same hotel that I stayed this time which is less than a kilometer away from where the airstrikes took place. I think something like 80 some missiles were used,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
five, six, I don't recall now, but uh, uh, apartment towers were brought down, killing God knows how many people. And so when I went this time for the funeral, those memories were with me. It was extraordinary. The crowd was maybe 1.5 million. Some say even more. And Lebanon is not a huge country, as you know, and it was extraordinary, especially since Hezbollah, uh, many of its members could not attend because they had to be careful of the southern border, the eastern border, the sea, and the north. They had to be on prepared for any Israeli attack. What was also extraordinary was that the Israeli regime, actually sent fighter jets over the stadium and the mourners twice,
Right.
and the F-15s and F-35s. Uh, but and we also heard that they
Can I make a comment on that? What were the Israelis thinking? Because in the United States, when we have the Super Bowl, when we have the world, major sporting events, they always have a flyover. It's an expression of honor. So the way to look at it is, yeah, the Israelis, they're honoring Sheikh Nasrallah. Way to go, guys.
Well, in a sense, they unwittingly did so
Yeah,
because they exposed their barbarism, and the crowd, they didn't budge.
yeah.
The regime was hoping that people would be terrified and there would be a stampede. I'm sure they were hoping people would die in the stampede, but no one moved. And it was so extraordinary that some of the foreign guests were not scared either, because they at first didn't even know. They thought that these were Lebanese
Yeah.
aircraft, and we had to tell them that Lebanon doesn't have an air force. They don't have air defenses. The reason why Hezbollah exists is because the United States and the Europeans will not allow Lebanon to be able to defend itself.
Right.
And so whenever the regime bombs, they can bomb at will whenever. And another thing is that this 1.5 million people, they didn't budge, even though these jets were bombing their homes just a few weeks ago. So the memory of the slaughter was fresh for all of them. For me, it was fresh because I was there during the first week where they were just bombing southern Beirut day and night, bringing down apartment blocks. I visited some of those apartment blocks, I did an interview, we did a sort of video visiting southern Beirut, and I said there that who knows who's underneath this rubble.
Right.
While I was standing there and smoke was coming out of the ground, there were like 4, I think, apartment blocks together that they brought down. And when we were standing there, I was just thinking to myself, and I was telling others that I don't know, maybe there are kids underneath screaming for help, or moaning, or dying, or who just died. But so these people had that horrific, and I was only there for a week, but the Lebanese, they had to experience it for many weeks.
Yeah.
And right now, as I'm sure many in your audience know, because your audience is very politically aware, the Israeli regime is still killing people. It's killing people in the West Bank. It's killing people in Lebanon, and it's murdering people in Gaza. It's violating the ceasefire. It's extraordinary. And Western mainstream journalists are quiet. Western diplomats quiet. Western governments are all quiet, even though they are the guarantors of the ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon. But
right.
They do nothing. And what is also amazing is that the Lebanese government, which has been installed by the Americans, even though the majority vote has been for Hezbollah and its alliances and its allies, but the Americans impose a government literally through threats and bribery that will not condemn the Israelis. They did not even complain about the flyover. They don't complain about the targeted assassinations that we've been seeing over the past few days. That's the sort of government that the people of Lebanon now have. But in any case, it was stunning. The crowd was enormous. There were Palestinians, there were Christians, there were people from different Christian and Muslim sects, there were Druze, and it was massive. And Lebanon had never seen such a crowd before under such horrible circumstances. People's homes had been destroyed. And we know that we now know that the Israelis were seriously contemplating bombing the funeral.
Yeah.
Maybe thousands of people could have been killed, if not more. And that, again, I think exposes the nature of the regime. One other thing, though, that I'd like to add is that we went to the south the day before the funeral.
I saw you went with Zainab, and Pepe, right?
That's right, and a few other friends. And we went, and it was amazing how Hezbollah and the resistance were able to hold the regime back. They were unable to take any of the towns that were literally stuck to the border.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't get into the towns. But they were held back, and many Israelis died there, but they won't announce their real numbers. Now there's some information coming out that's indicate that the Israelis have taken a lot of losses. But after the ceasefire, Hezbollah abided by its commitments. Then the Israelis began to go into these towns and started destroying all the homes, and they tore down the trees, the olive trees, trying to make that area alongside the border look like Gaza. And it looked like Gaza. And when we went to the border, and Pepe and I were speaking on video, we didn't see at that moment because our backs were to the Israelis, but they started pointing their rifles at us, or their machine guns at us. And then after we finished, our Lebanese friends who took us asked us to leave because they were afraid that that these soldiers would open fire, because they've done so in the past few days. They killed a 13-year-old girl. They killed a young man, the son of the mayor of some town. They've carried out targeted assassinations. So we left that area, but it was amazing what the regime can get away with, and how the West will not call it out. It will not even report it in the media. But the funeral was stunning, and I wish you were there. It was stunning.
How many other countries were represented?
I don't know. I know that officials from Iraq and Iran and Yemen were there. Many from I know people from Latin America came. I know that from across the Arab world, people came, but I don't know if about officials.
Okay.
But it was just there were lots of international guests.
All right. Well, it is what I find fascinating is Israel wants to be as belligerent and vicious as possible, but they're acting with some restraint over the last few weeks. What do you attribute that to?
Well, first of all, the regime thought that they would win this war
Right.
because they had some successes. They had the pager attacks, which killed lots of innocent people, maimed lots of innocent people, but it did hurt Hezbollah. And then they assassinated Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and then his successor, Sayyid Hashim Safieddin. And the two command centers where they were in were destroyed. So they thought Hezbollah no longer had central command and that it had gone blind and it didn't know what was happening. So they thought they'd take this out. But the resistance on the border, they were steadfast and they would not budge, despite the fact that they knew what had happened in Beirut and what was going on. So, and Western intelligence agencies and Western embassies and NGOs in Beirut were all mobilized against Hezbollah. But they remained steadfast and they humiliated the regime. I think that the regime is afraid that ordinary Israelis simply had too much. I think that Netanyahu would like to continue the war. And just as I think that he does want to restart the war in Gaza. But I think that perhaps Israeli society is not prepared. I've spoken to a number of people who know a thing or two about inside Palestine, and they say that Israelis are very demoralized and they're very exhausted. But I don't think that this is the end of the war. I think that we are going to have another round at some point. I don't know when, but the regime is very, we see provocation after provocation in Lebanon, in Syria, even though the Jolani regime, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS regime is doing nothing against the Israelis. The Israelis keep pushing forward and destroying more infrastructure. And in retaliation, they go and kill their own citizens. They go and kill minorities and Sufi, Sunnis, and others. The country is in chaos. The economy has collapsed. But so instead of trying to take back Syrian territory, they try to kill other Syrians. But we see the provocations in Gaza, and what is not being reported at all in the Western media is what's going on in the West Bank.
Right.
They are destroying town after town, city after city, displacing people, not just in Jenin, but in other areas. And the devastation, when you look at the footage of some of these cities in the West Bank, they're looking like Gaza. They're looking like the villages in southern Lebanon, which the Israelis went into after the ceasefire. And I should also, by the way, add, and I'm sorry for jumping from...
No. It's a conversation. It's like we're having coffee and chatting.
Well, I'd like to have a coffee actually right now. But in one other thing that I think I should point out is that after the 60-day ceasefire, the regime was supposed to withdraw from Lebanon.
Right.
And people went and liberated those areas because the regime did not want to leave. And ordinary people went, and 20, 25, 30 people, I don't know the exact number, were killed, including a number of women. And the women led the liberation of those border areas. And there's some iconic footage of like a woman standing in front of a tank, or another woman standing in front of these soldiers that were shooting in her direction, and you could see like the bullet hitting the ground near her, but she was saying, "Go back to your homes," meaning go back to Europe, wherever you came from.
Yeah.
And there was this other woman, she was carrying a flag, and seconds later, she was also martyred. So you would think that in the West, Western media, where they pretend to care about women and women's rights and all that, that these iconic pictures, a woman standing in front of a tank, or another woman unflinching in front of, as they were firing in her direction, you would think that these would be like top news stories, and their pictures would be in the media, and they'd be doing interviews with her. Nothing. Unless you follow the story on social media, you follow certain people who have Twitter accounts and who do Palestine and Lebanon and the resistance and the axis of resistance and that sort of thing, you would never know such a thing happened.
Well, look, our society's so twisted that probably the only way they'd pay attention if the people were killed were transgenders, okay? If they were guys claiming to be women and they were killed, then they'd be upset over here. Hey, that's outrageous, That's sort of how sick our society has become over here. I think one of the things you highlight is the Israelis covering up the losses that they've actually suffered. Now, I've drawn the comparison that Israel's population is about the size of the New York City metropolitan area, about 8 to 10 million. And if you let's take the Israelis' lowest number, 800 killed, 870 killed since October 7th on the military front. Put that in the context of New York City, if that was the police force. Having that many people killed on the police force would be seen as a disaster, as something unprecedented. Now, multiply that by about 7 times, because I think the numbers were between 5,500 and 6,000 killed in action, much higher. And I think over here in the West, there's not an appreciation for how that is the suffering that's creating inside Israel. The other element is not all of these Israeli soldiers are psychopaths. And some of them suffered tremendous psychological injury by virtue of the genocide and the abuse that they're meting out. And that is taking a toll on the Israeli military as well. So that it is, it is courageous on the part of those women to stand up and to put, put their lives on the line. But for those,
but your numbers actually are very interesting, because a senior Israeli official, and I'll send the link to you after the show, hopefully, if I remember, I'm going wrong. He gave a speech, and he said that we have 5,994 or 49 grieving families. And that basically means, and if we just assume that each family only had one dead soldier, that means almost 6,000.
Yeah.
And if just 4 or 5 families have 2, that means at least 6,000 people, according to this official, based upon what this official said, 6,000 people have died on the side. And the most heavy battles were on the border with Lebanon. I mean, they massacred people in Gaza for 16 months. But the battles on the border with Lebanon were very intense. They were unbelievable. They were the most intense that has ever happened since the creation of the Israeli regime. And it's really a miracle how these Hezbollah fighters and the resistance forces stood their ground. Again, going back to the fact that you had the pager attacks, and then you had all the embassies and the NGOs mobilizing against them, and the fascist groups like the Lebanese forces preparing themselves to stab them in the back. But most importantly, the strike on Seyed Hassan Nasrallah and Seyed Hashim Safiuddin, and these two important command and control centers. It's amazing that they held their ground, but they did. And then you had these people power, and then you had this funeral, which was just unbelievable. The scenes that you'd see when the flyovers, which happened twice, really low. They just went right above the stadium, and but no one budged. And then as soon as they passed, people started chanting slogans. One was "Hayhat min Nadillah," which is what the grandson of the Prophet said in Ashura in Karbala when he was resisting the despot of his time, which meant, like never to humiliation.
Yeah.
So the people were chanting, we are far away from humiliation. In other words, we will never be humiliated. It was amazing, the scenes. If I was joking, and if I said that if Hezbollah or Iran had paid the Israeli regime $1 billion to carry out those flyovers, it would have been worth it. It was so stupid.
Yeah.
And again, the flyovers were not even you mentioned in legacy media. You saw it online, and you saw it, and so people who were there who tweeted it or who put it up somewhere on social media. But again, it wasn't. If it had happened anywhere else in the world, there would be outrage.
Yeah, well, it's increasingly the legacy media is more and more irrelevant with each passing day. They speak to a smaller group, and the social media side of the house is what is opened up, and frankly has governments terrified because they can't control it. It's like trying to stop water from running downhill. It's got a force. It's a force of nature. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to we've seen Israel tried to make a lot of they had a big propaganda effort surrounding Hamas's release of the Bibas children, ignoring the fact that those children died at the hands of Israeli bombs, not at the hands of Hamas, and yet where the Zionists pushed this lie that Hamas or whoever strangled these babies, which is it's just a damnable lie. It's grotesque. Even though you had the father himself on videotape blaming Bibi Netanyahu and saying, you've killed my family, and Hamas even offering to return those bodies. And so they tried to gin this up, especially to incite it. It did a lot to raise emotions here in the United States. People were misled, deceived. But in spite of all that, now the release of the Palestinian hostages who've been held by the Zionists finally took place. So it almost seems that Israel is reluctantly being forced to go along with the peace process, even though they got the crazies, the Ben Gavirs and the Smotriches who insist upon perpetuating the genocide. They're being somehow it seems like Witkoff, Trump's envoy, is playing a big role in trying to push that forward. Have you picked up any rumblings that he's trying to work similar magic with Iranian leadership?
I don't think anything is happening between Iran and the United States. There was talk about potential negotiations weeks ago. And then statements that came out of Washington basically demanding Iran give up its conventional defense capabilities as well as its rights to a peaceful nuclear program. That led the leader to say that we're not going to have any negotiations with the United States. And I think and the president fully endorsed that position, and so did the Speaker of Parliament. So I think that for the foreseeable future, negotiations with the United States are just out of the question. Now, if the United States were to change its attitude towards Iran and to treat it with respect, and to offer something realistic that Iran would accept, then maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, I don't know, whenever, things could change. But for the time being, the Iranian position is that there will be no talks, and they have good reason to see it that way, to come to that conclusion. We had the nuclear deal, and the Americans violated it from day one, Obama, and then Trump tore it up, and then Biden, when he was before he became president, he said when he becomes president, he's going to revive it. He didn't.
Right.
And even though we had negotiations in Vienna, which I attended, I was there as like a media advisor. They came with they agreed upon a text. The Europeans accepted, and everyone thought we had a deal. But then Biden backed down. He backed off. He refused. He refrained from taking that final step. It was right before the midterm elections in the United States. So
he had to collect his APAC check. Okay, you remember Biden was the number one recipient of funds from APAC. So he was going to be. He was really at the Israelis had a pretty good leash around his neck.
But the Iranians also saw how the United States they dealt with the Minsk Accords, which ultimately behind the scenes the Americans were behind it. And we now know that the West never intended to implement the Minsk Accords, as we saw from Merkel's interview, from Hollande's interview, and from the interview of the former president of Ukraine. And more recently, even the ceasefire in Lebanon, the United States and the Europeans, they're guarantors. They let the Israeli regime do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
In Gaza, Trump, they do the same, but also Trump, he came out and said the third phase shouldn't be carried out. Palestinians should leave. Whereas his negotiator, his representative, was behind the deal.
Right.
So when the U.S. president is tearing up his own deal, not someone else's, not Obama's deal, his own deal, then that makes it, literally impossible for the Iranians to negotiate. We have to, by the way, see what happens with Russia too.
Yeah.
I think the Iranians will be watching to see if the Americans. Right now the signs don't look good. I was skeptical from the beginning. I'm not saying that the war won't end, but when there was a lot of euphoria, I felt that this is not going to end that easily. You have the issue of NATO, you have the issue of land, you have the issue of the Russian assets, and then we just saw Trump say that I think yesterday that the United States will continue to funnel weapons, and I don't know where this is going to go, but my feeling is that at least for the time being, the war in Ukraine will continue. And the Russians will, of course, continue to make advances. They have the upper hand. They always had the upper hand. I remember when the war began, I was in Vienna for those nuclear negotiations, and I was telling Western journalists, very well-known journalists, that Russia is going to win this war. And all of them said Russia will lose. Every single one. Yeah. And it was just amazing for me how delusional they were back then. I said, look, you haven't been able to defeat Iran. You haven't been able to defeat Venezuela. And you haven't been able to overthrow Cuba. How are you going to defeat Russia? But anyway.
Let's not forget the Houthis.
The Houthis and Ansarullah and so on. So the Europeans continue to be delusional. I don't know where the war in Ukraine is going to. I think that for the time being, the Russians will continue to advance, and that there won't be any major breakthrough. But I think you probably have more insider information than I do.
That war, look, that war is effectively over. Now, the killing's going to continue. The Ukrainians are going to continue to suffer massive losses. They have no way of reversing this. And Russia's in no rush. Their objective to demilitarize it. And in the process, they found out, hey, we can also demilitarize NATO, which is what they're doing. They have
what they've done.
They've exposed that the U.S. has no strategic depth. And by strategic depth, I mean the ability to quickly replace lost weapons and expand ammunition production and weapon production. Well, we no longer have that. Like in World War II, it was, really a matter of weeks and months that the entire industrial capacity of the United States was just like flipping on a light switch and the lights suddenly coming on. We can't do that anymore. And Europe is even a bigger joke. I mean, this would be, if the loss of life was not so terrible, this would be hilarious. I mean, they are literally like children dressing up in cowboy and military uniforms and pretending that they've got actual military power. They don't. They're completely spent and irrelevant. And yet they still think that they're important. That is, that's what's shocking in all of this. And I wondered what your view was with respect to the signing on January 17th of the security arrangement between Russia and Iran. I don't think that was just a coincidental date. I think Putin was sending a very clear message to Donald Trump before he came into office that the nature of the relationship between Russia and Iran has fundamentally changed.
Yes, it was intended to take place right before the U.S. presidential election. Both Iran and Russia have their relationship has improved dramatically ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, it has grown much better, but I think that it's clear as day that since the war in Ukraine began, Iran's sympathies lied with Russia, and Iran began to help Russia. Now, the West says that Iran provides huge. I mean, the drone force is basically more or less Iranian. The West says they have factories in Russia. I can't comment on that. Obviously, but they say Iran provides missiles and ammunition and even uniforms and all that. Iran had its reasons. One was that Iran saw how the West lied to Russia. The NATO advanced towards Russia's border. And and then they carried out the coup in Ukraine, and then they started ethnically cleansing the Russian Ukrainians. But also it was a threat to Iran because the expansion of NATO to Russia's border also includes Georgia.
Yeah.
Which is at Iran's doorstep. It's right to the north of Iran. Iran to the north is bordered with Armenia and Azerbaijan. And to the north of Armenia, you have Georgia. So for Iran, the expansion of NATO is a threat, just like it is to Russia. And since the West, they had the Minsk Accords, they violated that. The Iranians felt that they had to side with Russia, and that improved the relationship dramatically. Ironically, Larry, the United States and the Europeans have done more to expand Iran-Russian relations than anyone else.
Yeah.
They are the catalyst. I mean, Iran and Russia have lots of potential. The North-South corridor that they're now developing, you would have thought, now that they're developing, you would have thought that they would have done this decades ago.
Right.
But since we were brought up in this Eurocentric world, everything was focused on business with the West, relations with the West. We really ignored everyone else. But now that the relationship is developing, it's sort of everyone is wondering, why didn't we do these things 30 years ago?
Right.
And so the potential is huge, both for Iran and for Russia. So, of course, the military relationship, the political relationship, but also the economic relationship beyond the corridor. Both have huge gas reserves. Russia number one in the world, Iran number two. Both have huge oil reserves, and both have huge mineral reserves, which, in the case of Iran, because of decades of sanctions, have been largely uh, underdeveloped and, in many cases, untouched. So the potential for cooperation, I mean, the Russians want to export their gas through Iran. They want to export their oil through Iran. They want Iran to be a hub for Russian grain or grains and wheat, which can be exported to the Persian Gulf, to Africa, to South Asia, to Southeast Asia. So the Americans and the Europeans are their own worst enemy. They could have, if they had imagined that the United States and Europeans behaving differently towards Iran, things would not be like they are now, without a doubt. And I always say that that the Israeli regime, the Cold War aside, but the Israeli regime, its existence is detrimental to Western interests. It's a burden for the West because it's because of the Israeli regime that the United States is hostile towards Iran and towards our region and towards Yemen and towards the axis of resistance, but also it's the reason why people across the region and beyond, because it's not just about Muslims, it's not just about Arabs. This is a global issue. It's a humanitarian issue. I remember at the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, there was this photo of this young woman in Seoul who was protesting every day in front of the Israeli embassy. Back then, there were just, few people. And then the Israelis with the Western media were lying about the beheaded babies and the rapes and all that.
Right.
But after time, because the genocide and this Holocaust continued, people began to wake up, to look into the history. They heard about the Nakba. Most people had no idea what Palestine was all about. And then they saw that these stories were false. So then you gradually saw this global movement from Africa to Latin America to the United States, young American Jews, people, we saw, for example, the Secretary of State on his last day, when he wanted to take this victory lap, he was humiliated by a Jew and a Christian.
Yeah.
Sam Hosseini, a Christian, and Max Blumenthal, a Jew.
Right.
The two of them humiliated him, ruined it for him, and it went viral. Both instances went viral. So you see this global movement where people from all walks of life, all religions, all races, they're focused on this. So the Israeli regime has destroyed the West, the image of the West. It has destroyed its soft power. It's a burden to the West and to the United States.
No, they've done enormous damage to the reputation over the course of the last 17 months. One of the things, in my reading of that, at least what was published of the agreement signed between Russia and Iran, some downplayed it as not being requiring Russia to come to the aid militarily of Iran. I read it differently. I read it as this was done in a very diplomatic way, but the language that was contained in that agreement was basically telling Iran, if you are attacked unjustly and in violation of international law, we will be there to help. There was that. There was also the commitment to assist Iran with its the development of its peaceful nuclear program. And getting the Russians with that agreement, as I read it, was sending also a signal to the United States that you don't have to worry about Iran developing a nuclear weapon. We're not, basically, Russia's not going to allow that, or if that was being done, Russia would back away. And I think Iran recognizes that, right now it has something of a security umbrella with Russia that it didn't really have 6-7 years ago. And I don't think. Well, I don't. It's not a matter of that. The West doesn't understand that or appreciate that.
I think it's become clear, especially during the last 3 years, and Iran went to the aid of Russia, and especially when there were some reversals where NATO was able to force the Russians to retreat. At that time, the Russians hadn't mobilized yet, and back then it was these drones that made a huge impact, and basically became a huge asset to the Russians. So, according to Western media and Western governments, the Iranians assisted the Russians, and I think it's very clear that the Russians, their interests are in assisting Iran, because any weakness in Russia is not good for Iran.
Right.
And Iran took a principled stance as well, and the same is true with Iran. Any weakness in Iran is not good for Russia, and supporting Iran is a principled position. Iran doesn't want nuclear weapons. The leader, as you know, gave a fatwa about it. And the reason is clear. One is, number one, if Iran builds a nuclear weapon, then other countries in the region would want nuclear weapons. And many of these countries are unstable, they're small, and some of them have lots of money. And it's not a great thing for to have all these little countries with family dictatorships having nuclear weapons.
Right, right.
So Iran is a threshold state, which is itself an important statement. It's telling the Americans and the Israelis to back off. You don't have anything that we don't have. But they don't want the weapon. And if someone says, well, these are just fatwa of something fake, and the Iranians are doing something different behind the scenes. During the Iran-Iraq War, when the West gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, and I survived two chemical attacks. One was a nerve agent in 1984, and one was the Iranian calendar and the Western calendar are a bit different, but I'm pretty sure it was 1984. And then in 1988, I survived a mustard gas attack. Many, of course, didn't. But when the West was giving those chemical weapons, and of course it was Germany who was giving the actual gas.
Yeah,
you know. Remember gas chambers and all that? It was that country.
Yeah.
And the Americans were providing military intelligence, and then the Europeans and the Americans were providing military cover, and the French were providing jets, and the Europeans and the Americans were providing political cover. Back then, commanders in Iran, military commanders, went to the previous leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, Imam Khomeini, said, we want to produce chemical weapons to retaliate. And he said, no. He said, these weapons are immoral, and we can't have them, and Iran didn't produce them. Even though Iran, being an oil and gas producing country, it had that infrastructure and the ability to produce chemical weapons.
Had the technological skill, sure.
Exactly. So, based on principle, Iran hasn't done it. Of course, I think there is a reason why Iran is a threshold state, and that is it is itself a deterrence. But Iran doesn't want the weapon because a nuclear weapon has the sort of problems that I alluded to. But I think the Iranian-Russia, Iran is a very powerful country. It has a population of 90 million people. It has allies across the region that are very powerful. And the United States failed against Ansarullah in Yemen. They're not going to be able to defeat Iran, which is infinitely stronger with all its underground missile bases and underground drone bases. But still, for Russia and Iran, this agreement is very important, not just for the military component and the message that it sends to the West, both from the Iranian side and the Russian side, but also more importantly, I think, Larry, is the economic aspect.
Yes.
Because this realignment is is in line with this transfer of power from the West to Asia. As you were saying, the West no longer can produce. It's been deindustrialized to a large degree. Both Europe and the United States. Europe worse because of their own stupidity. In Ukraine, it's even more intense. But also the United States, as you mentioned, they can't even produce. After 3 years, they still can't produce ammunition.
Yeah.
And they're incapable of winning on the battle. I mean, a combination of 30-some countries. And then you have to include Australia and South Korea and Japan and New Zealand and others. They have not been able to even give the Ukrainians the ammunition they need to fight the war. So this realignment, I think, this economic realignment is huge, especially because the two countries have such enormous resources, and also because these two countries, along with China and India, they are the four sides of Asia. So you have West Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and of course, Central Asia in the middle. And I think that the West, by pushing China, they're pushing China towards Russia and Iran. By pushing Russia, they push it towards Iran and China, and so on. And in my opinion, although you hear some Americans say that we have to draw the Russians away from the Chinese and the Iranians, but after all they've done to Russia and Iran, I don't think President Putin is foolish to put any eggs in the American basket.
Yeah.
And I don't think the Iranians are going to be foolish, or Ayatollah Khamenei would never put any eggs in the American basket. They won't remove anything from their other baskets because no one trusts the Americans. And even if Trump was trustworthy, and he's not, I mean, as I said, with the whole Gaza deal, he's now rejecting his own deal. But even if Trump was, let's imagine the impossible, that we could trust Trump, who's to say that 4 years from now, the Democrats won't come to power and then negate all of what was done before? And that's what's been happening, with the nuclear deal. Of course, Obama never implemented it, but then Trump just tore it up. So no one is going to, it will take many, many, many years for people to begin to trust the United States in the event that a government comes to power in the United States that actually abides by its commitments.
Yeah.
But the United States, being this exceptionalist country, that's that sees further than others and stands taller than others, as Albright once said, the indispensable nation.
Yeah.
When it sees itself as above the law and exceptional, you can't trust it.
Yeah.
Because they can violate any agreement that they want because that's their right. But if you violate the agreement, you're in a lot of trouble.
If I was asked to advise either the government of Russia or Iran or China how to deal with the United States, I would say, I'm sad to say this about my own country, but you need to treat us like we're a career criminal, a sociopath, that no matter what we say, we're going to find a way to do bad and to do evil. I wanted to flag. I saw a video the other day that actually confirmed Iran's victory over the Israeli attack on October 27th. Because there are a lot of people in the United States said, "Oh, yeah, the Israelis wiped out Iranian air defense," and I know people like you and me would say, "No, they didn't." And people go, "Well, what's your proof?" What this was on YouTube, there's this kid, he's in his 20s. I think he lives in, right now in like Kuwait or Abu Dhabi, somewhere in there. And he got a visa to go travel in Iran. And he was traveling just shortly after Iran had hit Israel. And he showed up, I guess, first in Isfahan and then to Shiraz and then wound up in Tehran. He was in Tehran the night of October 27th when this attack took place. And so he just posted this video. He was doing the tourist thing, talking about how much he enjoyed the Iranian food and the people were great, wonderful culture and ancient history. But he's just sort of incidentally reporting that, basically he said, thank God I saw, all the missiles that were incoming were intercepted. Which is like, I thought, there you've got, I would classify him as an independent source because he wasn't being paid by any government. He was doing this on his own nickel. And his purpose wasn't to report on the war. But I think that's one of the, despite Israel's insistence that it's going to attack Iran again, if they do, they'll be destroyed in a way that they weren't this last time.
One of the interesting things is that most of those missiles that were down were actually down by Iranian-made air defense systems.
Oh, okay.
Rather than Chinese or Russian systems. And that says a lot about how far Iran has gone and advanced in its capabilities. But all that aside, let's say that young man was a propagandist. Let's say that, there are no Iranian missile systems. And if the Israelis had actually destroyed Iran's capabilities, then why not strike Iran again?
Yes.
I mean, they'd be foolish not to do so. Now that Iran, I think it was an American general who went, or a retired general who still had access, went on television, said Iran is sitting naked or something like that. Okay, well, if that's the case, and the Israelis have no problems with violating ceasefires in Lebanon or to advance in Syria and destroy all of its infrastructure during the Al-Qaeda and Jolani rule. And of course, as I said before, Al-Qaeda and Jolani seem to have no problem with these Israeli advances and airstrikes. But why don't they do the same to Iran? If Iran can't defend itself, I would advise them, if I was a psychopath or a sociopath, to attack.
Yeah.
To take out Iran's infrastructure. But they won't. Why? Because they know it's nonsense.
Yeah.
In fact, the Israelis, the airstrike that the Israelis carried out was basically an American airstrike. The Americans were the ones who were behind it. They did all the heavy lifting. It was their radar systems in Qatar and in Bahrain, in the Emirates, in Kuwait, in Turkey, in Iraq, and in Jordan. All of this network, they were coordinating everything with Israel. Just like when Iran attacks, they would be defending Israel through all this network that they have in the Persian Gulf and in Turkey and elsewhere. When the Israelis came, it was the Americans who brought the planes to refuel, the jets, and who did all the help them fly to Iraqi airspace to fire their missiles.
Right.
And of course, the jets are American and the missiles are American. But the point is that what the Americans and the Israelis did was that they carried out an operation and gave Iran, because it was the Israelis fought everything.
Right.
It was a major attack. And what they did was they allowed the Iranians to learn learn all about Israeli capabilities. So now Iranian air defenses are much more capable of dealing with any future threat. Just like the Russians, for example, when the ATACMS were first brought in, or every time these wonder weapons would be brought that were supposed to change the war and defeat the Russians, the Russians, after a couple of instances, they would begin to learn how to respond, and then they would start shooting down the missiles and the drones and so on. What the Israelis did was they gave the Iranians the capability to learn all they needed, or a lot of what they needed, to confront any future attack.
Right.
And so the Iranians are now building up their air defenses in a way in which would better deal with the United States and the Israeli regime in future, and the government has increased the budget for missile defense capabilities as well. So I think that things are worse today than they were back then. And Iran will, by the way, carry out its True Promise 3 strike. Just a week ago, I think, right before I went to Lebanon, the head of the Iranian missile force, General Hajizadeh, he said that Iran will carry this out. There's no doubt that Iran will do this at some point, but he's saying that we will, we're going to have one shot, we want to make sure that it has maximum effect. If the United States had the ability to attack Iran and win, it would have done so in 2003.
Right. Yeah.
The United States took Afghanistan, then they took Iraq. Mission accomplished. We all recall Bush, flying onto that aircraft carrier. We saw that mission accomplished. They were at the height of their power. Real men go to Tehran. That sort of thing was being said.
Yeah.
And Iran back then was surrounded by the United States, and it was much weaker than it is today. And the United States was much stronger, relatively speaking, than it was today. Why didn't the United States attack? Because they knew that the price was simply too high.
Yeah.
I mean, it would have been devastating for Iran. It would have been devastating for the United States. It would have been devastating for the world. It would have been far worse than Vietnam or Iraq combined. But now, Iran is much stronger than it was back then, both at home and in the region. And the United States, again, relatively speaking, because of their endless wars, because of their stupid economic policies, the United States is a weaker, a diminished country, comparatively speaking, to back then. So I don't see a scenario where the United States would launch a war against Iran, because I think there are enough sane people in the Pentagon that will tell the president that we can't win this. Yeah. And it would bring down the global economy. Yeah. Because all these regimes, these family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region, this is where the oil and gas comes from. And they are living in glass mansions and glass palaces, and their countries have American bases. If the Americans attack Iran, they will all be complicit. And that would be the end of oil and gas coming from the region. And that would mean the global economy collapses.
Yeah. Well, this is a lot of Americans think this is going to be a version of Top Gun 2, the Tom Cruise movie, which is, the absurd propaganda. Do you think the Russia played any role with Iran in counseling restraint? In other words, talking to Pezeshkian, but also to the IRGC and saying, look, under international law, you have every right to retaliate right now. But you think it's better to keep your powder dry for now, and if you will, take the high road so that you don't play into the Western propaganda. Because, as you know, Iran's routinely referred to as the largest sponsor of terrorism in the world. And yet, as I continue to point out, the numbers from the State Department's own Bureau of Counterterrorism don't support that. I mean, it's their own damn statistics. Don't support that. But the lie is repeated over and over and over, and because it's repeated so much, it becomes true.
Well, if you look at what Tulsi Gabbard said in the Senate, it's quite stunning, where she's basically saying what we've been saying and you've been saying for many years, that the United States has been supporting Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
And of course, ISIS, we know, came from Al-Qaeda. It was Al-Qaeda that split. So the United States supported ISIS. The United States supported Al-Qaeda. The United States has been, carrying out these dirty wars. These terrorists, these so-called Islamic terrorists, are American Islam. They're funded by regimes allied to the United States in the Persian Gulf region, oil and gas-rich regimes, and by the West. And Western intelligence agencies facilitated their travel to Turkey, to Istanbul, and also to Jordan. I remember in 2011, I was on sabbatical in Lebanon, 2011 and 12. And I was on sabbatical at AUB, the university, and later on AUB banned me from entering under orders from the State Department. That's a story in itself. The State Department told AUB that if you allow him on campus, you will be fined. But also, I was doing my sabbatical with Alistair in Conflicts Forum. And so I was, Alistair once told me, I think in late 2011, that this is a dirty war in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that when I was in Pakistan, Alistair, when he was in Pakistan in the 1980s, and the Americans and the Europeans and the British and the Saudis and others were supporting these extremist groups,
right,
Al Qaeda and others, and the groups that later became the Taliban, and they were creating this extremist force. He said to me that the same people who he knew in Pakistan were now in Istanbul. The people who he knew very well, they'd all moved to. So he said, look, he knew from then that, just by the movement of these people, that this was a dirty war.
Yeah, the usual suspects.
Exactly, the usual suspects. Now, I think that, I think that, after what Tulsi Gabbard said, it's quite clear who was supporting the terrorists and who was fighting the terrorists. General Soleimani, he led the fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, alongside Iran's border. And in fact, when he was murdered by the Americans, and remember, Netanyahu was supposed to be part of it, and he pulled out at the last moment. We know, who is pushing the Americans towards destructive and dangerous policies. Just as Jeffrey Sachs in that famous clip that Trump posted on social media.
The deep, dark son of a bitch.
Yeah, exactly. And how he was involved in all these wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and so on, which costed the United States tens of trillions of dollars probably. And of course, if you include the dirty wars, well over $10 trillion, I'm sure. But so General Soleimani, when he was in Iraq and he was murdered, he was on his way to see the Iraqi prime minister at that time, Dr. Adel Abdul Mahdi, who's a really great guy. And I met him, and he told me this story himself, the former Iraqi prime minister. He said General Soleimani was on his way to meet me to discuss rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis had sent a message to the Iraqi prime minister. General Soleimani had arrived in Baghdad, and he was supposed to meet him for breakfast in the morning when he was martyred. So the Americans, or the Israelis, or both of them, or the intelligence agencies that were feeding Trump false intelligence, or maybe Trump just didn't want rapprochement. I don't know what went on behind the scenes, but they were blocking rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia through this murder. But in any case, so we know that General Soleimani was fighting against these forces, whereas the Americans were funding them, according to Tulsi Gabbard, and of course the false flag operations for chemical attacks and so on.
Right.
In Syria, we know all that. But I think that probably, I'm sure that the Iranians did speak with the Russians and the Chinese and regional allies and friends and countries across the global south. But I think the Iranians themselves, they are a very patient. Iranian elites are very patient. And the leadership in Iran is also very patient. Iran is I think they say that, that they are, carpet weavers, and they're very, there's a lot of patience in Iran. And the leadership in Iran is particularly patient. And sometimes their patience makes a lot of people angry. They say, hit back, or, they want some sort of emotional response. But I think that the Iranians, the Iranian leader is I think a brilliant strategist, a strategic thinker, and he is very patient.
Well, let me we'll close out with get your thoughts with respect to Syria, because 3 months ago it was perceived that, oh my God, this is a incredible defeat for both Russia and Iran. Now, I was saying at the time, oh, hold on, you know, Russia and Iran would have liked it to have turned out different, and they certainly would not didn't want to have Jelani taking over, or Sharma, or what, Yeah, I always call him the queer eye for the straight guy. I don't know if you're ever familiar with that TV show in the United States where four gay guys would come into some slobby homosexual or heterosexual guy and clean him up, dress him up, fix up his apartment, teach him how to cook. That's what the West did to this Jelani character. Okay, took him out of all of his terrorist garb, cleaned him up. But I said at the time that, because they said, "Oh, Hezbollah's dead. Hezbollah will get no more support from Iran," and I'm going, have you people even paid attention to the last 3,000 years? There's been smuggling routes all across that damn desert.
If Iran cannot assist Hezbollah, how has Iran been assisting Gaza? Yeah. How did Gaza even get all these defense capabilities? It was through Iran. Yeah. No one but Iran's Hamas. I mean, the Turks pretend they do things, but no one gives them a single bullet. All those tunnels, all those sophisticated defense capabilities, they all come from Iran. Yeah. Or Yemen. How has Yemen been able to defeat the United States Navy? How does it receive its support? If Iran can support Yemen, and if it can support Gaza, then without a doubt, Iran can support Hezbollah. Yeah, I actually said something quite similar to what you said when Syria collapsed. I said on a couple of shows back during the first couple of days that this was definitely a tactical defeat for Iran and for Russia and the resistance. Of course, Russia. I'm not saying Russia is a part of the resistance.
Right. No, I understand.
But I think it was a tactical defeat for Hezbollah, for the axis of resistance, and for the Palestinian people. And it was a victory for Netanyahu and Erdogan and Biden. And we have to remember that Erdogan is complicit in this genocide. He's been giving Israeli regime cheap oil during this whole period of time, cheap oil from Baku and oil from Syria that goes through Turkey to Netanyahu. And he's done nothing to help. And he's also assisted in sending materials to Israel that the Israelis used to get through the Red Sea. But that aside, this is true. It was a tactical defeat. But I was saying also back then that I think that in the long run, this will actually be beneficial to Iran, to Russia, to Hezbollah. Why? Because until now, the West and these Arab dictatorships in the region, they've been saying that Hezbollah and Iran are supporting this dictatorship that's sectarian.
Right.
Where in fact, Iran didn't care if Assad was Christian or Sunni or Shia or Alawite. For Iran, what was important was that this dictatorship, which was a dictatorship like all the other dictatorships, that it was standing up to the Americans, and that it rejected this, and they were supporting the resistance in Palestine and in Lebanon. That's what was important for Iran. Otherwise, if it's a dictatorship, well, so are all these other regimes that are close allies of the United States. But that propaganda did have an impact. But now, two things have happened. These extremists are in power. People are seeing the footage coming out of Syria.
Right. How
they're killing people, how they're slaughtering people, how they're brutalizing not just the Christians and the Alawites or the Druze or the Shias or the Kurds. They're brutalizing Sunnis who are Sufi or secular. It's a regime that does not have the support of the majority. And it's a regime that's doing nothing against the Israelis. And it's meeting Israeli firster, their so-called foreign minister meets with Israeli firster, congressmen and senators. And so it is exposing the reality I mean, it comes at a cost for the Syrian people. They've mismanaged the country. The economy is getting worse. So people are seeing that, no, these are not real freedom fighters. These are the terrorists that the Iranians and others have been saying they were.
Yeah.
And if you look right now at the anti-war movement, their views towards Syria have evolved over the last decade.
Yeah,
10 years ago, they wanted the fall of Assad, but the very same people that back then wanted the fall of Assad now recognize what's really going on. Gaza has changed many things. And many of these people who supported these extremists, their hypocrisy has also been exposed because they were against them, the Americans in the West in Gaza, but they were supporting American and Western policy in Syria.
Right.
So their hypocrisy and the moral inconsistency has been exposed. Many people have woken up to the reality. I don't think this regime is going to succeed. And also, in addition to that, Larry, is the financial burden. Right. Syria was a burden to Iran, especially over the last 3-4 years. In the past, it's helped Iran in supporting the Palestinians, the West Bank included, and Lebanon. But over the past 3-4 years, Syria distanced itself from Iran. It went closer to the Emirates and the Saudis. It expelled the Iranian commander in Syria. And Iran was basically not able to do much anymore. It was very limited. And we saw these Israeli airstrikes, and Iranians didn't say it, but they believed that some of this information was being leaked to the Israelis about Iran and Hezbollah in Syria. And Iran was providing free oil. The Russians were providing free fuel. Iran was I just learned in Lebanon that Iran was also providing free gasoline to Syria and other at a time when this is a burden for Iran and for Russia. So now that the Turks and Erdogan, because Erdogan does not represent, a lot of people in Turkey that I know, even in his party, are not happy with these policies. I have lots of friends in his own party.
Yeah.
But anyway, the burden of Syria is now on his shoulders. The burden of Syria is now on the shoulders of Qatar, which funded ISIS and Al-Qaeda over all these years. So this burden has been removed from Iran's shoulders and from the Russian shoulders. And I think that ultimately, as I said earlier, that this regime will fail. And so now Hezbollah, which has been supporting the Palestinians, the biggest sacrifice over the past 16 months has been made by Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Gaza was fighting for its own survival. The Palestinians were fighting for their survival. But Hezbollah willingly sacrificed its men for the sake of Gaza.
Right.
To draw away the Israeli army from Gaza, to help Palestinian children survive. And mothers willingly sent their sons, wives willingly sent their husbands, and many of them were killed in the genocidal airstrikes too. So Hezbollah, I think they are the great heroes of this year and a half. They made this sacrifice for another people. So now Hezbollah's stature, despite all those years of anti-Hezbollah propaganda, because of the role Hezbollah played in Syria, that has been washed away. The reality of Syria is now becoming clearer to many people, except for those who don't want to open their eyes. And the burden is now on the shoulders of those people who've been supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, as Tulsi Gabbard has pointed out the truth about in the Senate. Yeah. So I think in the long run, despite the suffering of the Syrian people, which is tragic, I think the biggest loser is actually those who have been supporting, the biggest losers are those who have been supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria.
No, I would agree. Let's end on that positive note. I will say that anybody that's ever had a deadbeat relative or a friend that's always taking your money and trashing your house and making life miserable for you, understand what Iran feels like being free of Syria. Like, glad they went home. It's a bit of a burden relief. But Professor, listen, as always, I appreciate our conversation. It's enlightening. and I think people learn a lot from listening to it.
It's great speaking with you, Larry, as always. And too bad we couldn't meet in Lebanon, but hopefully we'll meet sometime soon.
Sometime soon in person. That'd be great. All right, I'm going to hit the end of the recording. Stand by. Professor Marandi and I didn't solve all the world's problems, but I think we gave you some good insights into what's going on in East Asia, or West Asia, as it's called, and particularly some of the dynamics that are driving events on a daily basis. Thank you for watching this episode of Countercurrents. I'm Larry Johnson. Encourage you to hit the like button. Also encourage you to subscribe and share with your friends, neighbors, colleagues. Thanks for watching.